Thank you very much for everybody who's joined the webinar today. As Laura said, I'm going to talk about the how health data is controlled and governed, largely for the use of research purposes. Okay, Laura, next slide, please. What I'm going to do is actually, for a moment, to take off my hat as a research professional and be what's called a data subject. We're all data subjects. We're all people who have their data being processed and used by other organisations. And when I think about what that means and what I expect of those organisations who are processing the data, I just want to talk to you about that first, and hopefully we'll all sort of recognise these principles and think about those in the research context later on. So as a data subject, I want my data to be used fairly, lawfully and transparently. And what I mean by that is I expect to know why my data is being used. I expect it to comply in full with every bit of legislation that might apply to it, and to be used fairly so that I know why and I can object, or I have certain rights over my data. I expect it to be used for specific purposes. So we'll have a little bit more on in this session and other webinars, but when I talk about that, we're saying things like, I expect my bank to hold my personal data for the purposes of providing me the service that a bank provides. I expect my GP to hold my data for the purposes of healthcare, not for other purposes which aren't really aligned to those expectations that I have. I expect my data to be used in a limited way, and this comes back again to those specific purposes. I don't expect my bank to be using it for anything beyond providing that service, and I don't expect my GP practice to be using my data for say financial gain that isn't related to healthcare research, or healthcare activities, that kind of thing. I do expect my data to actually be used when it's important to be used, and this is an important point to think about, because take, for example, I think of, should an accident ever happen to me, I expect those people who arrive on the scene to look after me from the NHS, the ambulance service, to have enough information about me to be able to look after me really properly at that point. I expect when I actually get taken to hospital, that all the people who look after me there have sufficient information to look after me in the way that's necessary for my healthcare needs. And that's an example of sharing that data when it's important to be shared, using that data when it's important to be used. Okay, next slide, please. So coming on to the data itself, I expect it to be accurate and, where necessary, kept up to date. So again, back to the example of my bank, I expect them to know my name, my address, and other details that will keep my financial data secure. I expect them to keep that up to date and for that to be accurate. I expect my data to be kept for no longer than it's necessary. So taking healthcare, for example, I expect that to be a very long retention all the way throughout the period of my life, I'd expect. But for another organisation who might only interact with me for a short period of time, say a hotel that I stay in, I don't expect them to hold my data for a very long period of time at all. I expect my data to be protected at all stages. So we know that in day-to-day existence, our data is being used in lots of different ways, and it's being moved around in lots of different ways. So sometimes my GP will send out, for example, letters to me. I expect my personal data to be protected in that process. If I'm providing personal data via an app, for example, again, back to my bank, that's an example, I expect that app to be secure and my data to be protected then. For data that's held on trust hospital secure services, I expect those servers to be protected at all times and not available to be hacked by any individuals. Okay, next slide, please. And then coming on to the people who actually use my data, and I think of people and their organisations. I want the appropriate organisations to be using that data. So for healthcare provision, I expect it to be healthcare providers, and the people within those healthcare providers. It's not a blanket approval for everybody to have access to my data. Only the people who are directly responsible for my care should have access to my patient, my data as a patient. It shouldn't be available to everybody within the organisation. Those people who are actually interacting with my data, I want them to be aware of their responsibilities. I want them to know how important it is to keep it accurate and up to date, how important it is to keep it secure, how important it is not to be aware that of any potential risks of that data being disclosed to somebody else. Okay. And next slide, please. So that's a bunch of principles which I think we can probably all recognise as data subjects, as people in the UK. In Pioneer, we've condensed those down into the 5 safes. So as I say, safe projects, we're talking about using it for research purposes. Is the use of the data appropriate? Is the organisation that wishes to perform the research appropriate? And is it going to be asking the right questions? Is it going to be providing important information for health and social care research? Safe data, is the data itself that's being used at risk of causing a disclosure? And by disclosure, I mean being able to identify an individual within that data set. Is that, for example, if there was a data set that was required that had rare diseases, there's quite a high potential sometimes that an individual might be identified within that data set itself. So how do we prevent that from happening? In terms of safe people, again, it's coming back to those organisations and those researchers. Can they be trusted to use it in an appropriate manner? Are they trained? Are they aware of all the responsibilities that are upon them for the things that I've just mentioned in a couple of slides ago? And then in Pioneer, we've also got safe settings. So that's the way that we hold the data, which is quite specific to research, because we want to hold it in environments, we call them, in digital environments which allow research to be taken upon it. So when we're putting things on electronic servers, etc., we have to make sure that we're limiting access to those data sets, to those safe people for those safe projects. Okay. And then finally, again, very specific to research, those safe outputs. So the purpose of research is to provide knowledge, which is often put in the public domain. That's the whole purpose of publications from researchers. But when people put that information in the public domain, we want to make sure absolutely that that's not going to be identifiable to an individual. We're not going to be able to find an individual from that data set. That's quite a difficult one, because we're thinking about what data we're actually putting out there, but we're also thinking what's already out there. Is there anything that could be linked to that data set to identify an individual? So these are all the rigorous thinkings that we've got to do around Pioneer to make sure that we're keeping all of that data safe, and we're following these 5 safes. Okay, next slide, please. So whilst I've been talking about these things because I think they're very important, they are also enshrined in UK law. So you might have heard of the Data Protection Act and the General Data Protection Regulations, GDPR, which is regulated by the Information Commissioner's Office. So there's a bit of legislation around there, and you'll find some links on these slides. There's law, there's a basis in law that's around there, which we as an organisation and all organisations have to comply with. It's that law which gives rights to us as data subjects. But also, Pioneer is a partnership in the NHS, and the NHS also recognises that it holds very sensitive data, and it holds it for a very important purpose, which is obviously healthcare. So we also have what's termed the Caldicott review and the Caldicott principles, which align very much to the kind of things that we've been talking about. In fact, a couple of those words in the slides are actually drawn directly from the Caldicott principles. So that's a very specific thing to the NHS, and it covers the driver to share information when it's vitally important for healthcare purposes. Okay, and again, you've got a link if you wanted to have a look at that. And next slide, please. So the Data Protection Act, in order to place responsibilities on organisations, has defined what's called a data controller. So the controller It's the organisation that directs what data is collected, how it's stored, and how it's utilised. It's pretty much in the name. It's kind of where the buck stops, really. They are responsible. They don't own the data, and I'll come on to that in a minute, though. So, for example, with Pioneer, University Hospitals Birmingham is the controller. We are processing medical data, which is taken directly from you. I say you, I mean patients, members of the public, possibly from other NHS providers, for example, GP practices, other service providers within the region. We store it on hospital systems. I'll talk a little bit more about that later around security, but that's how we're ensuring that we're holding it securely. We're using it for the purposes of treating people. Obviously, if you're a patient of ours, then it's for clinical purposes, but we're also making sure that the treatment that you receive is the best that we can provide, and research plays a huge part of that. So, as you can imagine, there's a lot of individuals who have responsibility within our organisation, within the controllers organisation, to make sure that the bits of legislation are met. And all of those things that I talked about as principles are complied with. So there's a raft of people around technical security, there's a raft of people around what's the purpose that we're using this for, that kind of thing. They are overseen by what is known as a Caldicott Guardian. And the Caldicott Guardian exists in every NHS body, and their purpose is to oversee that the principles, that kind of the things that we've discussed, are really in place, and to act as the conscience of the organisation. So they are someone to whom Pioneer approach to say, this is what we want to do. Is this reasonable? Do you think this is appropriate for the patients that we serve in our area? Okay, next slide, please. And controllers often don't operate alone. They operate with other processors. So an example for Pioneer is other NHS bodies who process data. So they're the ones who originally hold data for medical purposes, but they become processors when they provide it to UHB as the controller for research purposes. So that's a very clear and obvious data processor. One of the other data processors, which I very much like to talk about for Pioneer, is Microsoft. So our relationship with Microsoft is that they provide us a digital environment to hold our data as securely as we would hold it within our own hospital. We would put only de-identified medical data into that environment. And it's important to note that that environment is only accessible by people that the controller approves, that UHB approves. So it's only UHB staff who have access to that data in that format. Researchers are then granted access to data sets which are even less identifiable, or even rendered completely anonymous, to perform research on patient outcomes. And so in that way, UHB as a controller has absolute control over who has access to what data within that environment. And that's why we partnered with Microsoft, because we could achieve that level of security and protection for our data. Okay, I'm sure we might get some questions around that at the end, and I'm very much welcome those. Excuse me. Next slide, please. So I wanted to do a bit of myth busting and fact checking before we go into the question section, because I'm sure this will have generated a lot of thoughts in your mind. To reassure people, we only share data for the purposes of improving health and care. That's what we are here for as an NHS body. That is a reasonable expectation of the people who provide data to us. Patients expect that we're here for that kind of thing. And a prime example of what we've been doing recently is sharing health and care data around the coronavirus outbreak to help the NHS as a whole and the nation respond to this emergency. And if we were unable to share that data, we would be unable to respond in the way that we have done. We only use data when protections are in place to make sure it's going to be used securely and safely. We, as a controller, have a responsibility to make sure that those requirements are met, and we are absolutely performing due diligence on all of that, because at the end of the day, the buck stops with us, the legal requirement stops with us as the controller. Okay, next slide. So what we don't do is we don't share data with marketing and insurance companies. That's frequently asked in this field. But we do share data with companies who make products for the NHS. And we do that for the reason of helping them make sure that the products are safe and effective for the NHS and for the patients that we are trying to treat. We recognise the importance of companies in the health sector as being providing the next generation of drugs, treatments, devices that we need to service the needs of our patients and our populations. We don't sell healthcare data, we don't sell people's data, but we do recover costs. And this is a bit of a nuanced thing. Obviously, you can imagine there's a lot of people involved in holding data and processing data securely. There are people like me, there are people who are on the technical side of things, performing those checks, making sure that all of our systems are secure, and auditing that process to satisfy ourselves that that's absolutely the case. And those actions and activities come with a cost themselves. So with Pioneer, the running of Pioneer, what we're seeking to do is recovering costs to make those costs which run Pioneer, to make sure that this data is being held safe, securely, and is being shared with the right people for the right purpose. Okay, next slide, please. I'd just like to sort of round this off, and talking a point that I started off with is who owns your healthcare data. And I've had various different responses to that. Some people think that it's their GP, it's their NHS trust, that's their hospital, or does it go to the Department of Health? And the answer is no to all of those. It's the data subject. You who own your own health data, and you have a lot of rights as a result of that that ownership. Go on to the next slide, please. So lots of those rights are around having access to that data, making sure that it's accurate and up to date, being able to correct data if you feel that it's wrong, like changing your name, for example. But one of the key ones, which I'd like to talk to you a little bit about today, is the national data opt-out. So this is saying, I want my health data used for clinical care purposes, but I get to decide how it's used for research and planning purposes. And both of those activities, I'm sure you'll appreciate, are things that the NHS wishes to do to improve the healthcare that it provides. But we are providing the opt-out of having your data being used for those purposes, and that is the purpose of the national data opt-out. You can say, fine for clinical care purposes, but no to research and planning. There's a link there for how to engage with that system, also a bit more of an explanation about what it means to you as a data subject. But anybody within the Pioneer group, anybody on this in our expert panel today, would be absolutely willing to talk to you about what the national data opt-out means, and how important it is that everybody's aware of that as we perform research in the health and social care sector.